Good afternoon. Good afternoon. And welcome to the third part of these lectures, which is the most specific, if you want, on a very limited moment of my research and of my career, the New Catholic movements, which is an interesting way for me to study the Catholic Church from a multidisciplinary point of view. But most importantly, the book that you have seen yesterday and this morning that was published in English by the Liturgical Press last year is an important part to understand my path into theology, because it presents a few tensions between different aspects of the Catholic Church that are not just tensions that are typical of a scholar, but they are tensions that run through the Catholic Church as such. So the first tension, so that book that was originally published in Italian in 2008, and it was translated into Spanish in 2011, and in English last year. It presents, first of all, this kind of tension between an Italo-centric kind of church and the world church. So this book is an attempt to present a particular aspect of the Catholic Church of today from a very European perspective. So all these movements were born in Europe, in Italy and Spain mostly, but in Europe, and to try to see what this phenomenon means for the world church. The second tension is between a church that understands itself purely as a theological object, so that works only because of what theology says, or the church as something that has many aspects that we should consider when we want to understand what Catholicism is. There is a sociological aspect, there is an anthropological aspect, a political element in the highest sense of the word political. This tension develops into a third tension, which is between the church considered purely from an institutional point of view, or a church understood as a movement. So, as you know, institution and movement, they are polar opposite. So for a long time, the Catholic Church had a very institutional self-understanding. The new movements tell us that there's something that cannot be captured by the institution or by the legal discipline. There is another tension between, that's typical of my profession, of what I do, between the church understood as something that is settled, that is defined, that is stable, and the church as something that is developing, that's something that it is growing directions that we didn't expect. And finally, the last tension that pushed me to write this book is the attempt to look into the movements, the New Catholic movements, and to see how limited and distortive sometimes is the usual way of dividing things in the church between the liberal and the conservative side. This is something, so I don't deny that there is liberal mindset and a conservative mindset, I think that this way of looking at things is not always helping us understanding the complexity of the issues. The New Catholic movements, I think they present a very good case for the inadequacy of that. So this is the pre-origin of this book that started in my mind in the last few years of the pontificate of John Paul II, who is a pope of the New Catholic movements, really. He really boosted their presence, their voice, their independence, in a sense, from the institutional church. But then there is, when I started thinking about these things, there is a series of issues that I wanted to examine in talking about the movements. And the movements, for me, are very interesting from a theological point of view because they tell us something that is typical of the church in the 20th century, which is the desire to go back to Jesus, which is one of the most obvious things for us as Christians today, that the church should look more like Jesus than like Charlemagne or like Constantine or like the empire. But it's something that we developed as a church slowly. And the 20th century, it is really the explosion of that. And I think that the movement are an interpretation of this quest, of this really search for a way of being Christian that is closer to the real founder of the church. A second reason that inspired me to work at this book was, as a church historian, the problem of the foundational myth of new religious orders, new religious communities. It is a very delicate issue, especially when you have new Catholic movements that are very young. Especially when the founder is still alive, you cannot touch the foundational myth because it's like touching the founder. So this is typical of this way of organizing, of developing these movements, that there is a story of the founder who usually had an idea, had a difficult relationship with his local bishop often, and then looking for approval from Rome. So it is a story that tells us something that is always there in the history of the Catholic Church. Just look at the history of the Franciscans. So how many stories we have of St. Francis and of the foundation of the order, all different stories serving a certain purpose. And that doesn't mean that they are not true, okay? But they are true for different purposes. Something like that happens also with the New Catholic movements in Europe in the mid-20th century. And so it is complicated to methodologically, it is complicated to investigate these movements because, to be very honest, especially for the movements that are very solidified, very powerful, very visible, very active in Rome, it is difficult to find reliable historical sources that are not embellished or are not subject to a certain kind of operation that builds a certain history of the movement. So it is a history of the New Catholic movements that has to be very careful about the reliability of some sources. In a sense, we will be able to write a real history of communal liberation or focolare when we have access to those archives. That is not true yet for all of these. Usually, the history of the movement or the biography of the founder is written by a member of the same movement. That is completely understandable. It is part of the protection of a new community that is really part of all of them in Europe, especially, that have gone through a long period of suffering. It is typical a period of being misunderstood, of being not accepted in the institutional church. So they're still, healing. And so the protection of their history is part of that healing process. Now, what I talked about in this book is not the whole picture of the New Catholic movements. Let me be very clear. So we have instruments, books that have built a list of not all of them, but most of them. But that was not the intention of my book. The intention of my book was to present some historical, trajectories that say something of general trends in the Catholic Church in the 20th century, and some issues that I think are typical of the whole phenomenon. And I took the liberty to, make this hypothesis looking at some of the most visible movements that were founded in Europe between the 1920s, 30s, and the 1960s. The Opus Dei, the Neocatechumenal, Sant'Egidio, and Focolare, neo-monastic communities. These are the big names. So I think that this phenomenon is important because it is subject within a few decades. So if we take the 1930s and the 1980s, so 50 years, we have already an evolution of these movements. One is that these movements are important because they tell us that a certain exit from the juridical ecclesiology of the post-Council of Trent happens in some local circumstances already before Vatican II. So Vatican II, opens up for everybody a new understanding of the church that is more spiritual, less juridical, but something like that happens already before. And in this sense, it is one of the contributions of local experiences to the Second Vatican Council. But there is another evolution. These movements in Europe, they are born from a theological discourse, that is the discourse of the theology of the laity, of the lay people. What happens, it seems to me, in some of these movements, after a few decades, is that they do not always or do not quite see themselves, their members, as an option for all the lay people. It becomes very specialized, very challenging. It's not for everybody. For some movements, it's not for married men with children like me. It is you are not free enough to be part of some movements. So in this sense, there is a theological evolution of an idea in the 1940s, 50s, a rediscovery of the lay people that in some sense gets lost. And in some Catholic movements, they are not identifiable anymore right now as lay movements, but something third. Not clergy, not lay people, but something else. That's not new. So we have seen that all in the previous centuries already, but this trajectory it is interesting. And finally, one of the trends that I think we can see in their trajectory is that they develop between the 50s, 60s, and the 70s, and they are part, in a way or another, of the rediscovery of religion in the public square that French sociologist Gilles Kepel called the revanche des dieux. So God comes back to the political arena. And in a sense, some Catholic movements are part of that in their own way, in the Catholic way, which has a very, clear distinction, church and state. It is part of that. It's not part of Islam at all, which doesn't have a church, as you know. There's no church to get in or get out of Islam. The Catholic movements are part of this picture, and in this sense, the Catholic Church is a global phenomenon that we must be able to capture if we want to understand what it really is. So, in my book, there is a first part which is an historical part where I identify a few phases in the Catholic movements. So there is the pre-birth, let's say, the embryonic phase of the New Catholic movements, which is between Leo XIII and Pope Pius X at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, which is when Pope Leo understands that modernity is there. It's not going to go away. It's not something that will, pass overnight. And we need to go back to in society. And we have to say something about politics, about the economy. So this is a pre-original Catholic movement which is not independent at all from the authority. It is a papal movement. It is the Pope asking some specific kind of Catholics to become active in society. It is not an independent lay Catholic, elite. There's no such thing until the early 20th century. And then we have the period of Pope Pius XI and Pope Pius XII, which is the period of confrontation between the Church and nationalistic ideologies. And in those decades, 1920s, 30s, 40s, the Catholic laity is part of this global confrontation of the Catholic Church against fascism, Nazism, communism, extreme anti-clericalism in Mexico. Especially Catholic Action is the lay elite that the Pope mobilizes to fight against this movement, the claim of the state, of the nationalistic state, to control the Catholic Church, to control everything that goes in people's life. So it is the beginning of a certain kind of independence for a mature laity in the church. Why? Because it is more explicitly political. So Pope Pius XI and Pope Pius the 12th, in different ways, they encourage Catholics to be active in politics, in society, under their own name. So here, the European example, Italy and France and Germany. So it is the beginning of an acknowledgement of the Church looking at this independent laity that cannot be controlled by the authority if we want them to be effective. So we need to allow them, for example, to build political parties. And there's a very tight connection in Europe between early Catholic action kind of movements and the Christian Democratic Party. There is, they are part of one pool of personnel, of ideas, of sociologically. And then we have Vatican II. And Vatican II is interesting because usually the New Catholic movements, especially under John Paul II, there was this way to call them the fruit of the Second Vatican Council, which is true indirectly. So at Vatican II, the issue of New Catholic movements was never in any document, any debate. Nobody had that in mind. So the only way that they talked about was Catholic action. So there are documents where there's a long, detailed explanation of what Catholic action should be, but there's no idea of something after Catholic action or instead of Catholic action. So it's one of those classic examples to me that here Vatican II was effective not only because of its documents, but because of its spirit. So what created some New Catholic movements was not the documents of the Second Vatican Council that say nothing on them, but there's a certain idea of the Church. And so what happens after Vatican II, that you have a redefinition of what being a lay member of the Church means, and especially in the European context, is the almost total dissolution of that big army called Catholic Action. In a few years, the membership of Catholic Action really bleeds, and it becomes much, much smaller, but instead we have a myriad of other Catholic movements that are, many of them, they come from Catholic Action, but some of them don't. So it becomes a very diverse landscape. There are a few common features, but it is very difficult for the institution to understand what's happening. Until the 50s, Catholic Action in Italy had a few million members. It was easy to control that. There was one president, and it was easy. After Vatican II, it is more complicated. And what happens is that we have, with Paul VI, we have a very cautious acknowledgement of the New Catholic movements. Very, very cautious. I studied the papers of the Bishops' Conference, of the Italian Bishops' Conference in the 1970s, and those bishops were terrified that these people are too independent for us, so we should do something to stop them. That was the language they use. Also because they were worried that these independent Catholics, they were communists in disguise. So they were using the Catholic movement label, but they were actually communists. And so Pope Paul the Sixth slowly opened up. And in the last couple of years of his pontificate, He receives in the Vatican communion and liberation, the charismatic movement. So there are small steps. The real acknowledgement, solemn acknowledgement of the Catholic movements is with John Paul II, which is really part of his project for a new kind of presence of the Catholic Church in society. And he gives the Catholic movements, in some cases, almost a blank check. He considers Catholic action basically lost. He sees in Catholic action a betrayal, basically. So you had millions of members, and you lost almost all of them. So now let me call the other guys. So this is what happens in Europe, especially in the 80s and in the 90s. So big world gatherings organized by the movements. It is really one of the key features of the pontificate. And then Pope Benedict comes, and he has a very similar take on the Catholic movements, with some specificities. So, in Joseph Ratzinger's Ecclesiology, Catholic movements are perfect because they embody his idea of the Church as creative communities. So Pope Benedict, Joseph Ratzinger, never believed in a sociological Catholicism that is part of a church-state establishment. He never believed that. As a German, I mean, going through the 1930s in Germany, that's very understandable. So he says the New Catholic movements are perfect to reclaim the Catholic character of the Church. So that is really, really interesting of his take. He uses a similar kind of language that John Paul II used. So in this sense, there's a continuity. The Catholic movements are given a lot of freedom. They are encouraged, actually, to take more freedom, to be more active. And then we have Pope Francis, who's a little different, I would say, a little different. So, 2016, Polish Press will publish a short collection of my recent essays on the movements, and there will be one essay on Pope Francis and the movements. Observing him, my impression is that Pope Francis is inspired by this Argentinian version of liberation theology that is called Teología del Pueblo, the theology of the people. And I think, from what he said to the movements when he received them in Rome and he gave speeches in these last 2 years, we can see in him a much visible awareness of some risks involved in the movement Catholicism. Why I say that? Because in every speech that he gave to all these movements, he always told them, be sure that your activity, your presence builds unity in the church and not division. He's very, very clear on that. And he's not making a distinction between good movements. He says that to everybody. He's not picking and choosing the best ones. So that, it seems to me, his way of saying one thing that is at the center of his theology, which is this, that Catholicism is not something for the elite. It's not something for a small layer of educated people or of self-proclaimed saints, but it is something for the masses. It is open to everybody, and what I think he's saying is, I have seen as a bishop in Argentina that sometimes some movement, they tend to think of themselves like elites. And he says that as a Jesuit, and Jesuits have always seen themselves as an elite, as you know. So he's taking distance from a certain elitist understanding of the church. I think that is an evidence of how influenced is his pontificate by his experience as a bishop. It's something that it's not that obvious, let's say that. So that this pontificate as a bishop of Rome, who serves the universal church, is very much shaped by his experience as bishop in Argentina for 20 years. So here in the book there are classifications. So I identify different kinds of movements as an ideal type. So there's this kind of movement. So one kind of movement that I think is very visible is what I call movements of the Reconquista, the Spanish culture movements that come out of Spain in the 1920s, 30s, and Mexico, Spain and Mexico, the legionaries, who come out of a dramatic clash, a tragic clash between the church and nationalism and anti-clericalism, and they develop a very structured kind of movement. That's one type. There's a second type that I call the movements of the Reconstruction. So I put in this category the Focolare movement and the early Communion and Liberation. So they understand that World War II means something for the church culturally and institutionally, something that must be rebuilt with those same stones, those rubbles, but in a different structure. So that is another category. One other group that is typical of a certain period, especially in the 70s, is what I've called the Catholic dissent. So the organized dissent from the church teaching, the church institutional aspect. It's something that fades away mostly. We have something like that still, like we are the church, this kind of thing. And then there is another kind of movement which are called, not just in my book, the neo-monastic communities. And so this neo-monastic life, so monks that choose not to be ordained priests, so they want to be lay monk members of these communities. They are very ecumenical. They see themselves as a kind of movement because they have a following that is beyond the walls of their monasteries, and they have a dialectic relationship with the institution, with their bishops usually, or the establishment of the church. So these are just four possible ideal types of movements. This book is a work in progress. I mean, it's because this movement is a work in progress. I mean, it's not something that is going to be settled very soon, not at all. So, to conclude in the last few minutes is this. I think that for a theologian or for a Christian member of the Catholic Church, there are a few questions that this movement asks of us. And there are questions that I don't think every movement has an answer yet. So they are asking these questions to the whole church, I think. And one of the questions is related to one of the first issues that I mentioned, is so do they have a lay identity or not? So what kind of lay members are they? So is that the same lay status that I have in the church, that my wife has, or being a member of Communion Liberation, for example, or of Sant'Egidio, puts you in a different category. So that is not a purely abstract question. It is something that has an impact on the way different Christians have part in the church. It's not an issue of power. It's not that I want to be as powerful as they are, but it is something that is interesting because this reality of very different kinds of lay members in the church is something that's happening beyond any possible juridical, canonical provision. So all these movements, so if we would build a synopsis of what we know of these new movements and what the Code of Canon Law tells about them, so we would think that the Code of Canon Law is the law for another church. And so the law hasn't captured this, and this is good. So don't believe that I think that everything that moves in the church should be codified. Not at all. But there's something there that I think should be investigated intellectually, spiritually. Because, in a sense, the Code of Canon Law, the institutional church, is still working in a pre-Vatican II situation. While the Catholic Church today is a post-Vatican II church. And so there is some disconnect there that, if we go and look at the history of the Code of Canon Law of 1983, there was a proposal towards the very end of the drafting process to add a section, a paragraph on charisma, on the juridical relevances of charisma for the Catholic Church, and in the end they decided not to have that section, which is, I think, interesting. There is another issue that these movements, especially in the European churches, and I will say why, especially in the European churches, they present the church, which is that in some countries of ancient Christianity, like Italy, Spain, France, Germany, the Catholic Church in these last few years has been very indulgent with these movements, indulgent in the sense of leaving them a lot of freedom. And what this created is a situation when there's the perception of the Catholic Church with two kinds of members. So one of the old ways to describe medieval ecclesiology was this idea that there are duo genera Christianorum, two very different kinds of Christians. The ordained ones and all the others who don't matter, really. And now in some local churches, in some dioceses, so there's this idea that you matter, you count, you are visible if you are a member of a movement. If you are a lay person, a totally lay person, if you want, you are not. What can you do for us? Basically, that's the question. And so in this, there are deep, deep tensions in some churches. And this is not true just of Europe. So there is a very important example in these last few years that is typical of the Catholic Church in Japan. The bishops of Japan have tried to convince Rome of the deep problem caused by the neo-catechumenals in Japan. And it's an ongoing thing. So it's not the only case. That is the most famous, because they met with the Pope several times, all the bishops back and forth. It is a high-profile thing. So what happens sometimes in local situations is that these movements they create a dynamic that is not always healthy in local churches sometimes, and that brings me to another point, which is this: that, as I know, I work on the Second Vatican Council, but I think that one of the geniuses of the Catholic Church that was expressed at the Council of Trent was the idea of a territorial parish. That there's a parish, there's a territory, there's a bishop, there's a territory, and they reside there, and your membership in the church is defined by geography, which is at the same time imperial. So it's a typical imperial way of controlling the situation, but it's also very inclusive. It's very inclusive. It's supposed to be inclusive. In some experiences, like Japan, for example, but experiences, we see that in some interpretations of the movements, it becomes an exclusive kind of experience. And this is it's something that in some cases happens because of the requirements of being member of a movement that, for example, serves the poor. You have to have time. You have to be able to do these things. In some cases, there are ideological requirements. So I think that this is one issue, and this book, it's not a book against the movements, not at all. It just asks questions that I think are part of this conversation. In the end, I think that this phenomenon of the movements is extremely important, and I'm convinced that this is the future of the church. I don't think that we will be a church without the movements in the near future, because of two big movements, of two big trends in what is the Catholic Church of today. And the first one is that the Catholic Church is going to be, if not post-European, largely extra-European. And the European legacy of the Catholic Church is largely a certain institutional system where geography is the criterion to define what local community is. In this, Pope Francis, by appointing the new cardinals 2 weeks ago, he told us what kind of geography he has in mind of the church. So these movements, many of them were born in Europe, but now they are everywhere in the global Catholic Church. What's happening is that they present us a version of the Catholic Church that is not bound to be a replica of European Christendom. And that is very, very important. And connected to this, there's the second element, which is we are finally accepting the idea that Christianity and the Catholic Church in the future will not be still defined by a church-state establishment that basically in modern Western history is the fruit of the end of the religious wars of the 16th, 17th century. The usual date is 1648. So it's the end of the religious wars in Europe. The churches and the state, the kings, emperor, princes, they cut a deal. We will take care of the whole thing at a high level, the bishops and the prince, the bishop. So we are going to see a different kind of church, and going back to a movement kind of church is really part of that. So I strongly believe that this phenomenon will be part of the future, if not of the present. I think that that somebody had to ask these questions, because they are questions that have been asked several times in Bishop's Synod, for example. In 87, some bishops, cardinals asked this question. In these last 25, 30 years, not much has been published on that. And so this was the last book that I wrote before leaving Italy, before leaving Europe. So that was part of this new sense of freedom that I was enjoying by leaving Italy, by saying, now I leave. I can say something that maybe some Italian Catholics are not really ready to address, because the Italian church is a small church, so everybody knows everybody else. It can create some friction, some tension. So that is, my service to the development of this research, and so I would stop here, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you. So it's a very interesting question. So I think that it doesn't fit one of those four categories. And it tells something, not just of my difficulty in understanding where to put that movement, but it is one of the challenges that is this. Europe, after the end of World War II, has been largely Americanized. Consumerism, TV, all these things. One of the things that hasn't migrated to Europe is religious culture. It hasn't, except for small groups. So there's no mass religious culture, transplant. In this sense, the charismatic movement is one of those movements that is very active in Italy, Europe. It has grown. It's not one of those movements that is very visible. Why? Because in the European tradition of this last century of movements, they become visible when they go into politics. So when they become interested in elections, social political issues. The charismatic movement in Italy is not part of that. So I think that it is part of a completely different category that is by itself. That's what I would say. I think that you know more than I do about that. But I agree with you. So their legacy, especially Opus Dei, in Latin America, has left a very heavy footprint. In this, it's undeniable that the preference of John Paul II for that kind of model of spirituality, of culture, has had a huge impact. It is true that they have managed to control many episcopal appointments. So here, what I was saying that this phenomenon is richer than the liberal-conservative divide. We all know that their presence there has been of a certain kind. So I'm not here. We should, build different pictures for different areas of the world. Latin America is for certain the area of world Catholicism that has been most influenced by Opus Dei. That is, with results that in many cases are disturbing. I'm not shy about that. Again, this is one of those cases when the whole picture tells us that Opus Dei, especially in the 80s, it fit perfectly a certain need of the Catholic Church there to build an anti-communist posture. It was perfect. It is so these Spanish-inspired who were born during the Civil War in Spain, they face a similar, or they think a similar kind of situation with liberation theology. Yes, there's no question about that. It's something that I think we will or we should recover. In this sense, a Latin American Pope, I see his election of Pope Francis as paying off some debt that the Catholic Church created with Latin America in the 80s and 90s. In a limited way, in a very limited way. But what he's doing in the Catholic Church is potentially something that could reverse the unfortunate, in many cases, decisions made for Latin American churches. It is clear that the Opus Dei offered a skeptical, at best, interpretation of the Second Vatican Council. That is, and something that for the Latin American continent was completely opposite to the general, consensus between lay people of what Latin America needed. So I completely agree with you on that. The first thing is that Pope Francis is not a liberal, but he's not a conservative either. He's a traditional Catholic, but I wouldn't call him conservative. So what he has said, so here, and I think that for a Catholic, the expression tradition is much stronger than any, conservative liberal thing. So just to be clear on that. So, as I said this morning, he's not a huge fan of individualism, right? But I don't think that we can. So, I don't know anything of the Canadian political situation, almost anything. But I don't think that you can win that kind of battle by saying you should give up your individual rights. What we should say is that all persons have individual rights. All human beings have individual rights. So, in my conscience, I know that individualism ultimately destroys the common good. But in the public arena, I don't think it works to say to non-Catholics, to radicals, to tell them you should give up your individual rights. I don't think it works, to be very honest. I think it can work saying, look, you should allow other individuals to have the individual rights, even if their lives, in your judgment, are not worthy of being lived. So that is, I think, the kind of language I would use. And I'm no politician. I mean, there's enough politics in the university, so that's as much as I can do. So now, what is interesting of Pope Francis is that I think he understands that these huge issues is not something that can be solved with a crusade of any kind. So I think he knows that it's only a certain kind of witness that can restore a certain credibility and a certain credibility of the message and of the messenger. That is, so here there's no change between his moral views on abortion, between John Paul, Pope Benedict. The interesting change is how we talk about these things. And it's one of the most difficult, heartbreaking things, that we have to accept that the power of the Church on this earth has limits. And so I think that euthanasia is wrong. I think that abortion is wrong. I don't think that we will solve that problem by issuing excommunications. It is. We know it didn't work in this last half a century, basically. So if history teaches us anything, I think we should avoid those mistakes and find new language, knowing that we will not be able to solve the issue completely. In this, there's a very important, arc of history. So yesterday, the most important president of the University of Notre Dame in the US, which is the most important, Catholic university in the US, said a few years ago in a speech, said we should be able to interact in public as rational human beings, making intellectual arguments. This is what we can do. That is, in the end, I think that at some point in the next century or so, we will look at abortion the same way now we look at slavery, where it was completely normal for Catholics in the US until the 1880s, 1890s, to see slavery as part of the system, more acceptable. Every local community is a history in itself. So it is part of this phenomenon where you have, in some cases, the same name, same label, but locally, the example of communal liberation in Italy and in North America is very different, very, very different. So how do you interact as an institution with these movements that are nominally the same, but in the two areas of the world are different? So that is part of this learning process. So I think it's very positive when new movements, they have their own vocations. I think it raises some questions when they build their own seminaries and their priests are willing to serve only the movement. That is a big problem for me. So you are called to serve, and it's not your choice. It should be somebody else's choice. So that is part of the tension, and I think the institution is, trying to find a way to develop, nurture these vocations at the service of the whole church. This is what can really change the whole picture and the role of the movements in the church. I'm not speaking weather-wise, but for Christians, the world out there can be chilly. In some cases, frightening chilly, and a small community gives you something that the old Christendom, the old sociological Christendom could give you, and now nobody can give you. So that is really, in a sense, the anthropologists who have studied the movement say that it's typical of the members of the movement a certain apophaticism. So they cannot explain why they are there. I think it's typical, and it's a good sign. So that if you're drawn there by something that you cannot explicitly define, I think it's genuine. Okay, so in this sense, what they teach to the church as an institution is that Christianity is not a culture, is not a system, it's an experience. That is, and again, that was much easier when the Catholic neighborhood, a whole Catholic world, the experience of Christianity was coming at you whether you like it or not. Now you have to find that experience. And these movements, they provide that kind of environment that is very, very precious. I think it's, and in a sense, I'm against an over-regulation of them. Laws can kill the experience. I think, in a nutshell, that is what they provide and why they are important. Thank you very much.